Welcome back to Whispers of Wisdom, the channel where timeless books aren't just read, they're felt, questioned, and lived. And in this video, we step deep into the fourth and final part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, covering chapters 65 to 70, the most intense stretch yet, where Nietzsche strips away masks, illusions, pride, and even hope itself, because this channel exists for one purpose: to break complex philosophy into living wisdom that speaks directly to your inner battles. And in this episode, you'll journey through the magician, out of service, the ugliest man, the voluntary beggar, the shadow, and noontide. 6 chapters that confront guilt, self-deception, spiritual exhaustion, and the terrifying silence of absolute clarity. And remember, this book unfolds in 4 parts, each part darker, deeper, and more demanding than the last. So if you're new here, you're entering the climax of Zarathustra's long descent into human contradiction and self-overcoming. And if you've been with me from the beginning, this is where everything you've heard so far finally starts to burn away illusions instead of comforting them. Chapter 66. Out of service. In this chapter, Nietzsche delivers one of his most biting and quietly devastating critiques, because here Zarathustra encounters a figure who represents not failure, not rebellion, but exhaustion. A man who has not been defeated by enemies, but worn down by the very system he once served. And the phrase "out of service" becomes a powerful metaphor for the collapse of meaning in a world where roles persist long after their purpose has vanished. And this man once belonged to a higher order, a priest, a thinker, a moral authority, someone whose life had been structured around duty, belief, and obedience. Yet now he stands emptied, no longer believing, no longer commanding faith, and no longer capable of returning to innocence. And Nietzsche is exposing the tragic aftermath of dead values, because when belief systems decay, they do not simply disappear. They leave behind people whose identities were built upon them. And Zarathustra listens to this man not as a judge, but as a witness, recognizing that this figure represents a transitional human type, someone born too early for the new values and too late to remain loyal to the old ones. And this is one of Nietzsche's most compassionate moments, because he does not ridicule the man's weakness. He understands that decadence is not always moral failure. It is often historical misplacement. And yet compassion does not turn into endorsement, because Zarathustra also sees the danger of clinging to obsolete roles, because those who are out of service often seek revenge against life, blaming the world for no longer needing them. And Nietzsche is warning us here about ressentiment in its quietest form, the bitterness of those who feel discarded by history. And the man speaks of having served faithfully, sacrificed himself, denied pleasure, and followed rules, only to find that none of it guaranteed meaning. And this confession cuts deep, because it reveals the hidden bargain at the heart of many moral systems. Endure now, be rewarded later. And when that reward fails to appear, despair sets in. And Zarathustra does not offer consolation, because consolation would preserve the illusion that life owes compensation for obedience. Instead, he exposes the deeper truth that life has no such contracts. And this is where Nietzsche's philosophy becomes brutally honest, because he refuses to redeem suffering retroactively, insisting that suffering only gains value when it is transformed into strength rather than used as evidence of injustice. And the man out of service cannot do this yet, because he is still measuring his worth by past sacrifice rather than present becoming. And Nietzsche shows how dangerous this mindset is, because it easily turns into moral accusation against the living, against joy, against creativity, and against those who refuse to suffer in the same way. And Zarathustra's response is sharp but necessary, because he insists that service without self-creation is slavery, even when it is freely chosen. And this challenges one of the deepest assumptions of religious and moral traditions, that obedience itself is virtuous. And Nietzsche overturns this by arguing that obedience without growth produces hollow souls, and the man's exhaustion becomes a warning to the listener. Do not build your identity entirely on service to ideals you did not create, because when those ideals collapse, you will collapse with them. And yet Nietzsche does not abandon the man, because Zarathustra allows him to join the company of the higher men, not because he is strong, but because he is honest about his emptiness. And honesty here is the first step toward transformation. And this inclusion reveals a subtle truth, that the higher men are not heroes. They are broken figures in transition, united not by success, but by the potential to overcome themselves. And the chapter's emotional power lies in its quietness, because there is no dramatic confrontation, no grand declaration, only the slow recognition that an old way of life has ended without a replacement. And this mirrors the modern condition precisely, where many people feel out of service in a world that no longer rewards loyalty, sacrifice, or obedience in the ways it once promised. And Nietzsche's challenge is not to restore those systems, but to demand that individuals become creators rather than servants. And the chapter closes with an unsettling calm, because no solution is offered, only a demand. That meaning must now be forged rather than inherited. And Zarathustra walks on knowing that the greatest danger is not rebellion or despair, but stagnation, the refusal to move forward after belief has died. And this is the quiet cruelty of the chapter, because it leaves the listener with a responsibility they cannot outsource, reminding us that once we recognize our values are exhausted, the only honest response is not nostalgia, but creation. Chapter 67. The ugliest man in this chapter, Nietzsche, confronts one of the darkest psychological realities of the entire book by introducing a figure who embodies not external ugliness, but the inner deformation produced by guilt, resentment, and self-loathing. And the ugliest man is not monstrous because of his appearance alone, but because he cannot bear to be seen, because visibility itself has become unbearable to him. And when Zarathustra encounters this man, the atmosphere grows heavy, almost suffocating, because this is the moment where Nietzsche addresses the consequences of killing God without overcoming the values God once enforced. And the ugliest man confesses that he killed God not out of courage or liberation, but because he could no longer endure the feeling of being eternally observed, judged, and measured. And this confession reveals a devastating truth: that moral surveillance can deform the soul so deeply that freedom becomes impossible even after the authority is destroyed. And Nietzsche is exposing the psychological aftermath of religious guilt, where the internalized judge survives long after the external one is gone. And the ugliest man's hatred of God was rooted in shame rather than strength, because he wanted darkness, concealment, and escape from accountability rather than creative affirmation. And Zarathustra's response is one of grave seriousness, because he recognizes that this man represents the most dangerous outcome of nihilism: the rejection of transcendent authority without the creation of new values, leaving behind only emptiness, self-contempt, and paralysis. And Nietzsche is uncompromising here, because he shows that destroying old idols does not automatically free the spirit. It can also strip it naked without giving it new form. And the ugliest man's suffering is profound, because he despises himself not for what he has done, but for what he is. And this self-directed cruelty is far worse than external punishment, because it cannot be escaped. And Zarathustra does not offer forgiveness, because forgiveness would preserve the moral framework that created the wound in the first place. Instead, he offers something far more difficult: the demand to overcome shame itself. And this is one of the hardest teachings in the book, because Nietzsche is asking whether a human being can affirm themselves without needing justification, redemption, or absolution. And the ugliest man cannot yet do this, because he still believes that existence requires moral permission. And this is why he hides, because he has not learned to stand in the open without apology. And Nietzsche uses this figure to critique both religious guilt and modern moralism, because both produce the same psychological deformation: the belief that one must be worthy of existence. And Zarathustra's presence becomes unbearable to the ugliest man, not because of judgment, but because Zarathustra embodies an unashamed affirmation of life. And this exposes the ugliest man's inability to say yes to himself. And yet, Nietzsche does not cast him out, because rejection would only deepen ressentiment. Instead, Zarathustra allows him to remain among the higher men, suggesting that even the deepest self-loathing can be transformed if one abandons the need to be justified. And this is a terrifying possibility, because it removes every excuse for despair, and the chapter's power lies in its refusal to console, because Nietzsche is not interested in healing through pity. He is interested in transformation through self-creation. And the ugliest man stands as a warning of what happens when one destroys meaning without learning how to create it, and as a challenge to the listener: can you live without a judge, without shame, without the need to be redeemed, and still affirm existence? And this chapter leaves us unsettled, because it shows that the greatest prison is not imposed by gods or societies, but by internalized condemnation, And freedom begins only when one dares to stand in the light without asking for forgiveness. Chapter 68. The voluntary beggar. In this chapter, Nietzsche introduces a figure who at first appears humble, harmless, even spiritually admirable, but who gradually reveals one of the most subtle dangers in the entire final part. Because the voluntary beggar is not poor by necessity, but by choice, not powerless, but deliberately stripped. And this choice is presented as virtue. Yet Nietzsche is deeply suspicious of it, because voluntary poverty can easily disguise resentment toward life itself. And when Zarathustra encounters the beggar, he hears a familiar tone, the praise of simplicity, the rejection of wealth, the moral elevation of need, and the quiet accusation that abundance is corrupting. And Nietzsche dismantles this posture carefully, because unlike overt hypocrisy or theatrical despair, the voluntary beggar believes in his own renunciation, and that belief gives him moral authority over others. And this is precisely what Nietzsche finds dangerous, because renunciation that claims superiority becomes a hidden form of domination, and the beggar speaks of freedom from possessions, from ambition, from struggle. Yet beneath this freedom lies withdrawal, avoidance, and a refusal to engage fully with existence. And Zarathustra senses immediately that this is not strength, but retreat, not liberation, but fear of responsibility. Because to renounce the world without first mastering oneself is not transcendence, it is escape. And Nietzsche is making a critical distinction here between simplicity born of abundance and simplicity born of incapacity, because only the former is creative, while the latter becomes moral accusation against those who dare to affirm life's fullness. And the voluntary beggar claims peace, but it is the peace of lowering expectations rather than expanding strength. And Zarathustra's discomfort grows, because he recognizes that this figure embodies a deep temptation for seekers to abandon struggle rather than overcome it. And Nietzsche is ruthless in exposing how easily humility becomes moral superiority, how easily poverty becomes a badge of righteousness, and how easily withdrawal becomes disguised as wisdom. And the beggar's rejection of possession is not accompanied by creation, not by generosity, not by transformation, and therefore it remains sterile. And Zarathustra does not condemn wealth or poverty in themselves, because for Nietzsche, these are secondary. What matters is whether one's condition expands or contracts the will to power. And the voluntary beggar contracts it, because he chooses a small life and calls it virtue. And this chapter resonates deeply in modern contexts, where minimalism, detachment, and withdrawal are often praised without questioning whether they arise from strength or fatigue. And Nietzsche is asking a sharp question here. Do you renounce because you have surpassed, or because you cannot endure? And Zarathustra's response to the beggar is not angry, but clear, because he sees that the beggar has turned away from becoming, choosing comfort over risk. And this is why Zarathustra refuses to elevate him, because elevation would validate avoidance as wisdom. And yet the beggar is still allowed among the higher men, because Nietzsche understands that even retreat can be a stage, and that judgment without understanding produces resentment rather than growth. And the deeper lesson of this chapter is that life does not ask for moral gestures. It asks for engagement, and renunciation that does not return to life enriched becomes a dead end. And Nietzsche's critique here is devastating precisely because it targets something often considered noble, revealing that even humility can become a mask for fear. And the chapter leaves us with an unsettling reflection on our own choices, whether our simplifications are acts of mastery or acts of retreat, and whether we have chosen less because we need less, or because we dare not want more. And Zarathustra walks, unknowing that the path forward will require neither possession nor poverty, but the courage to affirm life without hiding behind renunciation. And this chapter quietly prepares us for the final confrontations, where affirmation, laughter, and earthly joy will stand against every form of disguised denial, and the voluntary beggar remains behind not as a villain, but as a warning that even the rejection of the world can become another way of saying no to life. Chapter 69. The shadow in this chapter, Nietzsche presents one of the most haunting and psychologically intimate encounters of the entire work, because the shadow is not a stranger, not an enemy, and not even a clearly defined individual, but the residue of Zarathustra himself, the trace left behind by his teachings, his influence, and his movement through the world. And when Zarathustra encounters the shadow, he is confronted with the unsettling realization that ideas do not simply liberate. They also cling, distort, and follow. And the shadow represents the follower who has lost himself in following, the seeker who has abandoned creation in favor of imitation. And this is one of Nietzsche's most honest self-critiques, because he acknowledges that even the strongest philosophy can produce dependency rather than independence. And the shadow speaks in a voice filled with exhaustion, hunger, and restlessness, confessing that he has followed Zarathustra everywhere, absorbing fragments of his teaching without fully understanding them. And this partial understanding has left him unanchored, because he no longer belongs to old values, but has not yet created new ones. And Nietzsche is exposing the danger of transitional states, where liberation without self-legislation produces anxiety rather than strength. And the shadow's suffering is subtle, because he is not oppressed, not punished, but unrooted. And this unrootedness is terrifying, because it lacks both enemy and refuge. And Zarathustra listens with discomfort, because he recognizes his responsibility in this condition, understanding that even teachings meant to free can produce dependence if they are taken as doctrines rather than challenges. And this is why Nietzsche insists repeatedly that Zarathustra must be abandoned, misunderstood, and even rejected for his teaching to succeed. And the shadow embodies the failure to let go, the inability to turn inspiration into creation. And Nietzsche is uncompromising here, because he shows that admiration can be just as paralyzing as obedience. And the shadow's desire is not to surpass Zarathustra, but to remain close to him, to borrow meaning rather than generate it. And this proximity becomes suffocating, because Zarathustra's path was meant to be solitary, not followed step by step. And the shadow's hunger is not for truth, but for direction. And Nietzsche warns that this hunger can never be satisfied externally. And Zarathustra's response is severe but necessary, because he refuses to provide answers, comfort, or leadership, insisting instead that the shadow must turn away and face himself. And this moment reveals Nietzsche's deepest pedagogical principle, that true teachers must be willing to be abandoned, misunderstood, and even resented, because otherwise they become idols. And the shadow's tragedy is that he wants Zarathustra to replace the gods he has left behind. And Zarathustra refuses this role completely, because to accept it would betray everything he stands for. And this chapter resonates profoundly with modern audiences, especially in an age of influencers, ideologies, and charismatic figures, because it exposes how easily liberation turns into new dependency. And Nietzsche's warning is clear. If your freedom depends on following someone else's path, it is not freedom. And the shadow's restlessness reflects the existential cost of borrowed meaning, because without self-created values, even the most radical ideas become burdens. And Zarathustra's final act here is not kindness, but honesty, because he allows the shadow to depart unsatisfied, knowing that growth requires discomfort. And the chapter closes with a quiet but devastating insight that the greatest danger of philosophy is not being wrong, but being followed too closely. And the shadow fades not because he is defeated, but because he must choose whether to become himself or remain an echo. And Nietzsche leaves us with an uncomfortable but empowering truth, that your task is not to walk behind Zarathustra, but to walk away from him, carrying only what you have made your own. Chapter 70. Noontide. In this chapter, Nietzsche brings the entire emotional and philosophical tension of the fourth part into a moment of blinding clarity, because noontide is not merely a time of day. It is the symbolic peak of light, the hour when shadows disappear, illusions lose their refuge, and everything stands exposed without excuse. And Zarathustra experiences this moment not as triumph, but as an almost unbearable stillness, because when nothing is hidden, there is nowhere left to flee. And Nietzsche is showing us that the highest moments are not ecstatic explosions, but silent confrontations with total presence. And at noontide, Zarathustra lies down, overwhelmed not by fatigue, but by fullness, because the world no longer presses upon him as something to overcome. It simply is. And this is one of Nietzsche's most radical ideas, that the highest affirmation of life is not striving, not struggle, not even joy in motion, but the ability to rest without guilt in existence itself. And this moment directly echoes the doctrine of eternal recurrence, because noontide represents the point where one could say yes to the world exactly as it is, without modification, without escape, without hope for something else. And Nietzsche is testing the listener here, asking whether they could endure such fullness without turning it into boredom, distraction, or anxiety. And Zarathustra senses that this stillness is dangerous, because human beings are conditioned to seek purpose in movement, tension, and becoming. And when all striving momentarily ceases, the question emerges: was the striving ever necessary? Or was it a way to avoid being fully present? And this is why noontide feels almost oppressive, because it strips away narrative, progress, and justification, leaving only existence itself. And Nietzsche's genius here is that he does not romanticize this moment. He shows it as both sublime and terrifying, because affirmation without conditions demands the death of excuses, and Zarathustra realizes that to affirm life fully means accepting not only joy but repetition, not only creation but return. And this awareness presses down on him with immense weight, because eternal recurrence is no longer a concept. It is a lived possibility, and the silence of noontide becomes the silence of judgment without a judge, where the question is not whether life is good or evil, but whether one can love it enough to live it again infinitely. And Nietzsche is careful to show that this is not a moral test, but an existential one, because there is no reward for passing it, no punishment for failing it, only honesty. And Zarathustra feels himself suspended between laughter and dread, because to say yes to everything is to relinquish the privilege of complaint, resentment, and longing for elsewhere. And this is why noontide is so rare, because most people cannot endure a world without shadows, where blame, hope, and denial vanish. And Nietzsche is suggesting that the highest state is not permanent enlightenment, but fleeting lucidity, moments where life is experienced without filters. And Zarathustra's stillness is not passivity, it is mastery, the mastery of not needing to react, improve, or escape. And this chapter stands as the calm before the final surge, because once one has tasted noontide, one cannot return to naive striving. And yet, one must return to the world, because affirmation must be lived, not hoarded. And Nietzsche leaves this chapter suspended in quiet radiance, inviting the listener to imagine what it would mean to rest at the center of existence without apology, and to ask themselves whether they could endure such clarity without inventing new shadows. Because noontide is not an ending, it is a measure, a silent question placed at the heart of the soul. If everything were revealed, would you still say yes? In this video, we walked through 6 devastating chapters. We saw false spirituality collapse in the magician, purpose dissolve in out of service, guilt scream in the ugliest man, pride disguise itself as humility in the voluntary beggar, the endless chase for meaning in the shadow, and finally, the blinding stillness of noontide, where all excuses disappear and only life itself remains. And if these ideas shook you, confused you, or made you uncomfortable, that means the philosophy is doing its job. So make sure you revisit the earlier videos in this playlist to see how Zarathustra was slowly preparing us for this confrontation. And stay with whispers of wisdom, because the next video takes us even deeper into the final chapters of the book, where celebration, madness, awakening, and the ultimate sign collide. And trust me, the ending is not peaceful, it's transformative. So stay curious, Stay courageous and stay with me for the final descent.